What would you do if, one night in the middle of a snowstorm, a towering creature appeared at your doorstep, cradling a strange child, and looked at you as if begging for help? Contrary to what you might believe, Bigfoot isn't always the predator. Sometimes it's the outcast, banished by its own kind for giving birth to something different. I'm Helen, a widow who spent 20 years in the Wallowa Mountains, and this is the night that changed everything I thought I knew about the legendary monster. In the next 60 seconds, you'll learn why a Bigfoot mother risked everything to entrust me with her child, how we survived steel traps and a ruthless poacher, and the haunting sign that proves she's still watching over me today. One winter's night, my 15-year-old son and I freed her and her baby from a hunting camp. Before vanishing into the blizzard, she turned, nodded in gratitude, and was gone. The following spring, I found 2 smooth red river stones and a single strand of pure white fur on my porch. If you skip this story, you may never discover what Bigfoot truly is, and why it might find you again, even when you think you've forgotten. Wind needled the tin roof, a restless hand raking across the mountain night. The cabin sighed at every gust, boards clicking, chimney breathing slow. Eddie lay awake in the small room off the kitchen, listening the way he always did. Like the dark was a radio and he was turning the dial. Under the weather's hiss, something rose and fell. Not coyote, not elk. A low sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a cry, as if grief had taken a throat and tried to speak through it. He sat up, reached for the smooth creek stone he liked to keep under his pillow. Pinkish red, the color of a sunset swirled into quartz. Warm from his palm. He slipped his boots on without lacing them. The floor was cold. He knew which boards complained and stepped around them, careful the way he was careful with birds' nests and spider webs. He unlatched the door and eased out to the porch. Snow had not yet come, but frost feathered the steps. Breath hung before him and drifted away. The moon was thin, a rind over the black shoulders of the pines. That sound came again from the timberline beyond the yard. Far, then near, then far, like it didn't want to be found. Eddie touched the stone to his lips and put it in his jacket pocket. He whistled, a thin note he used for strays, one short, 2 long, then let the silence fold in. The air answered with a hush of needles, then a hush that wasn't wind at all. There, under a ponderosa whose bark broke into puzzle pieces, was a shape too big for any man. The figure shifted, almost recoiled from his small sound, then stilled. The old lantern hung by the door threw a small amber circle into the yard. It brushed the figure the way dawn brushes a wall, barely. In that weak spill, Eddie made out matted hair the color of wet chestnut, shoulders slumped from more than weight, and arms curled around a bundle pressed to the body like treasure or wound. He did not run. Fear skittered through him and slid off, the way water runs around a stone. He moved down the stairs, palms open, knees loose, head tipped the way Grace Whitlock had taught him when they checked a tangled calf. He stopped at the edge of the frost line. The smell reached him, earth and rain and a dark musk braided with iron. The bundle lifted its small head, white. Not milk white. Snow under starlight, the kind that holds shadows. Fur pale as sifted flour. Eyes that took the lantern and set it glowing inside them. A soft red ember, not a blaze. The small mouth opened and closed, sound catching. Eddie sank onto the bottom step until his knees brushed the cold wood. He turned his hand over and offered the back of it, the way he did with scared dogs, the way he had once done with a deer fawn that lay shaking beside a logging road. The larger creature shuddered and drew the bundle tighter. A low tone rose out of its chest, round and hollow as the throat of a big drum. No threat in it. Warning, yes. But braided into the warning was a plea so raw it pricked his eyes. He let his breath soften. 1 short, 2 long. He whistled it soft as he could. The white-faced little one answered back, not with a whistle but with a hum through the nose, bright and clumsy, a copy of a copy, and somehow exactly right. Eddie smiled without showing teeth. He touched the stone in his pocket and felt the smooth heat of it climb into his fingers. Behind him, the door scraped. Helen stepped out with the lantern in her hand and a blanket around her shoulders. Sleep had not yet left her face, but the night's noise had sharpened her eyes. "Eddie," she said, the name barely air. He didn't turn. He tipped his chin toward the pine. She brought the light up and the yard deepened. The figure gathered itself. In the lantern's circle, hair showed its true color. Brown threaded with gray, debris clinging, skin torn at the shoulder where wire had bitten. The face was not human, and not a mask of any animal she knew. It was heavy-boned and sorrowful, the brow ridged like a ledge over those deep-set eyes, the mouth shaped for power and now used to hold back panic. In her arms, the small one blinked, the lashes silvered by frost. Helen's fingers found the boy's collar and pulled, steady, automatic, like scalding water had surprised her at the stove. Eddie rocked back but kept his hand open, palm down, gentle as a leaf settling. The large creature flinched, then met Helen's gaze. The look held. A whole conversation rushed between them without language. Nowhere to go, nothing left to try. "Help me, don't take him. Look what they did." Helen felt the old ache stir where her life kept its unspoken things. Nights of being told to hush and endure. Promises traded for groceries. The years she had stayed because Eddie needed someone who would never insist he be someone else. The mountain made a new sound. Not wind, not the river. Footfalls up on the slope, heavy and soft at once, like a drum under a quilt. Helen raised the lantern higher and the light broke into the trees. A row of shadows took shape among the trunks, tall as porch posts and broader. They stood and watched with the stillness of stones and the sadness of windows in a burned house. No faces, only the suggestion of shoulders, hair lifting and settling. One turned and another, and then the row unzipped into the forest. Not a word, not a backward glance. Tracks marked the hillside, dark ovals pressed into frost. They angled away from the cabin toward the ravine where the creek ran under ice later in the year. Something in the way those impressions edged off without wandering said everything. There was no place at the fire for the white one, and the law of the ridge had been carried out. The lantern shook once in Helen's hand. She steadied it on the post and stepped down one stair. She did not let go of Eddie's shirt. The brown giant watched her and did not move, except to draw the small body closer. The blood at her shoulder had dried into the hair like rust. The smell of it salted the air. "Please," Helen whispered before the word could harden, and wondered who she was asking. Eddie pushed the stone into her palm. She felt its warmth, ridiculous and human and holy. He whistled again, the pattern softer, like a lullaby, and the small one answered, then leaned toward him, nose working, taking the measure of soap, wood smoke, and boy. The big one let an arm loosen. For an instant, the night felt like a held breath that might not be exhaled. The lantern wick spit. Helen drew the blanket from her shoulders and laid it across the frozen step as if she were setting a table. "It's warm inside," she said, quiet, to the air between them, to the ridge, to whatever listened. The giant's gaze cut from the door to the boy to the slope, and something like calculation moved through it. Not human numbers, not the town's arithmetic of debt and gossip. The old math of mother and winter. A tire popped in the distance. A muffled backfire, then the faint, steady note of an engine on cold air. Helen turned her head toward the county road and the small town beyond. Supper dishes drying on racks. Late news murmuring through 2 channels. Men who talked too loud at the Last Light Tavern. She lowered the lantern. "Come on," she whispered to Eddie. "Inside." They backed up, a step at a time, hands open. The big one edged forward, testing the edge of the light like a deer reading fence wire. The little one made a soft, urgent sound. Eddie answered, sweet and shy. The world shrank to breath and frost, and the slow flex of enormous fingers around a small spine. When they reached the porch, Helen felt the plank under the welcome mat give with the familiar tired creak. She stopped. Eddie stopped. The big one stopped. The engine sound faded until it was only memory. The trees drew close again. A long moment passed, long enough to count the holes in the lantern's tin shade, long enough to hear a single flake of frost fall from the eave and shatter like sugar on the step. The giant's eyes lifted to Helen's once more, and the plea in them didn't fade. It deepened, like a lake when the wind drops. She nodded, a tiny thing that said what 1,000 sentences could not. The big one shifted her weight. Eddie brushed his sleeve against the porch post as he turned for the door. A glint snagged the lantern's light, fine as a filament, pale as the inside of a seashell. Caught in the splintered wood, a single hair, white and soft, trembled in the draft and held. He reached out as if to free it, then left it where it was, bright and strange and almost beautiful, like a promise the night had made and didn't yet know how to keep. Dawn didn't arrive so much as thin the dark. The shed behind the cabin held its breath, boards gone gray, a rusty horseshoe over the door pretending to keep luck. Helen swept a patch of floor, laid a wool blanket, set a chipped bowl of warm water where steam rose in pale threads. On the stove, a mason jar with a rubber nipple sat in a pot to keep goat milk warm. The big one would not lie down. She stood between the boy and the world, one shoulder torn where wire had chewed, eyes climbing to every creak. Brown hair hung in damp ropes. When wind pressed the boards, she leaned toward the sound, reading distance by instinct. Eddie sat in the doorway, where stove light met cold. He slowed his breath, then put a small pattern into the air. One short, two long. The white one answered through the nose, a wobbly hum that steadied. Again, the notes found each other. The shed kept time. Helen tested the bottle against her wrist, wiped the nipple with her apron, then knelt with hands low where the big one could see them. Warm breath shook her sleeves. She waited. Eddie waited. Permission arrived like a door unlatched. The big one's arm loosened a fraction. Eddie slid closer, offering from the side so it wouldn't feel like a challenge. The white mouth found the rubber with a quick little gasp. The first pulls were frantic, then steadier, a wet machine learning and getting good. Milk drummed into the small throat, the sound like rain in a barrel. Something unknotted in the big one's face. Not relief? Not yet. A loosening. Her gaze skimmed Eddie's cheek. Boy, breath, hands. Eddie let the small throat rest, then offered again when the hum asked for more. Each pause taught patience. Each swallow taught trust. Helen banked the fire. Heat climbed a careful degree. She lifted the scarf that had hung on a nail for years, her husband's scent long rinsed out, leaving only wool and cedar. She stepped in slow and laid it across the giant's injured shoulder, just the weight of it. The big one flinched, then stilled. Two mothers looked at each other. Not kin. Understood. Down on the county road, a pickup coughed. Sound travels clean and cold, and rumor travels cleaner. Last week at the Last Light Tavern, a woman swore she heard a scream near Bear Cut. A man laughed and said free meat walks if you know where to look. Helen felt that laugh in her jaw. She pulled the kitchen curtain and set a hand on the cloth as if she could muffle a world. Back in the doorway, Eddie shortened the first note, lengthened the last, and waited. Snow Red matched him, clumsy, proud. The big one let a tone go so low it trembled the water. Rhythm settled into comfort. The shed smelled of wet hair, wood smoke, and the faint metal sweetness of healing blood. The jar emptied. A white line clung to the baby's lip. Eddie wiped it with his cuff and dipped his head. A thank you in a language neither had learned but both knew. The baby's fingers explored the threaded rim, tapped and patted. The big one hovered her hand above Eddie's sleeve, almost touching, then gathered her young close again. Snow pressed its face to the night without falling. Clouds scraped the ridge and held. A dog barked once and quit. Helen hung another blanket over the inside of the shed door to cut the draft, tucking the corner under a nail. In the jam, a fine white hair had snagged. She left it. For a while, they only breathed. Eddie hummed. The small one answered. The big one watched the space between them like a narrow bridge the three had decided to cross. The engine's note rose and faded. Faces at Stenson's store crossed Helen's mind. Someone counting bullets, someone selling a story with a price. She checked the latch twice, then stepped out to pump water. Rubber boots whispered on a frost. The mountains listened. She swung the lantern low along the fence. The beam found a print, deep, crisp around the edges where frost hadn't yet blurred it. Heel square, toe worn smooth, tread cut in a pattern she didn't know. Not rancher, not logger. It faced the shed. Beside it, the ground held the shine you see when someone stands too long and weight polishes dirt. The frost there was thin and dry under the overhang of a juniper, a place wind keeps bare. Whoever had watched knew where to wait. She kept the light on it a long breath. Then two. She did not call the boy. She turned slowly along the fence. Nothing moved. The lantern hissed and settled. Far off, a train laid a low line across the valley. She went back in and eased the door. Wood kissed wood. The baby stirred and set a small note loose. Eddie answered, one short, two long, and the shed took up the rhythm again, a quiet pulse under the larger silence. Helen poured the last of the warm water into the bowl and set the jar to dry on the sill. She listened as she used to listen for Eddie's fever to break, counting breaths, choosing trust each time. Before she let the curtain fall, she looked once more toward the fence and the trees that start the mountain. The dark gave nothing back, yet it felt occupied, like a held breath. She slid the fabric into place and stood still, one hand on the latch, one on the edge of the door, a body bridging two rooms and two worlds. In the shed, the hum kept time. Outside, the night kept its question. Between them, something fragile and stubborn gathered itself and waited to be named by morning, or by whatever would come through the trees before then. Morning fog clung to the tree line. The yard held the quiet of a held note. Eddie stepped into it with his jacket half zipped and the creek stone in his fist, eyes tracking a flash of yellow over the meadow. A meadowlark hopped from post to post, wings beating in quick bursts. He watched, then lifted his forearms and copied the tiny scoops and stops, elbows tucked, wrists loose. From the shed doorway, the white-furred little one watched. He lifted his arms too, tentative, then flapped with a clumsy joy that shook his whole body. A low, pleased rumble vibrated his throat. Eddie laughed, not loud, only enough to make space safer. The big one behind him, brown, torn at the shoulder, held still and let the moment be. They tried again. Eddie added a small hop. The pale body answered with a wobble that nearly tipped him into the straw. Eddie steadied him and rested his palms 1 second on the soft cold of fur. The big one eased, a fraction. Helen stood in the doorway, listening to how the morning arranged itself. Stove tick, goat milk simmering, Eddie's careful breath, the low drum inside the giant chest. She hummed, an old habit from nights when the boy only slept if the air moved like a slow river. The sound gathered what she didn't sing and rose. The big one answered. It wasn't a copy but a harmony, a long round tone rising to meet her pitch and holding it. The air seemed to slow. Helen let the melody wander through the small turns her mother had used, a tune rockers know without paper, and the big one shadowed it. The sounds braided until Eddie's eyes shone, and the baby lowered his head and blinked heavy, right on the edge of sleep. For a breath, the shed felt like a chapel of boards and steam. Tires hissed on gravel. A truck door thudded. Helen's shoulders stiffened, then eased when she saw the sheriff's hat. 2 armloads of cut pine braced against his coat. Cole Redding knocked once with his boot and stepped back, voice casual. "Brought you some wood. Figured you'd be short on minutes." She thanked him and waited for the weather tucked inside his small talk. It came slow. "Ran into a fella I didn't know at Stenson's," Cole said, placing his words like they had weight. "Asked about the trail up past Bear Cut. Wanted to know if the creek's iced yet. Said he was after cats. Didn't smell like cats." His eyes touched the porch, the yard, the fence where frost still held. "Keep your curtains. Folks like that collect questions and trade them for money." Eddie hovered in the doorway, passing the stone from palm to palm, gaze flicking from badge to boots to the line of wood that meant heat and soup and a decent evening. The big one stayed still as weathered timber. Cole shifted the last pieces into place and tugged his gloves. "You let me know if you hear things that don't belong," he said, then tipped his hat and went the way he'd come, truck coughing, finding a gear. Lantern low, Helen walked the fence. Frost lifted around wiregrass. Between the chicken coop and the shed, the earth changed. She saw it before she knew it. Dark ovals pressed clean as stamps, spaced far apart in a rhythm no human strides. Toes splayed, edges crisp under the juniper's dry overhang. The row curved behind the cabin, circled wide past the porch, then vanished toward the ravine where the creek cut down through fir. She knelt, glove off, fingers spread against the shape. Her thumb filled one toe. The distance between prints stretched longer than her stride by half. A father, tracking the exiled young. Or something else. Using a story as bait. The thought moved like a splinter and would not come out. Back inside, she set the rifle on the table. Old Winchester, bluing gone thin, stock-nicked where time had had its say. Her hand shook. The gun brought its own ghosts. Shells chatter in the tube, bolt click, that heavy silence after a shot that erases the world and writes it back wrong. She didn't want those sounds in this house. She also wanted them, if wanting means the thing you pray you won't need. Eddie watched her. He crossed the room and opened her fingers one by one, gentle, like smoothing a crumpled page. He put the creek stone in her palm and folded her hand over it. Warmth traveled up her arm and settled behind her ribs. She let out a breath she hadn't named and set the rifle flat, not away. Afternoon thinned into that gray that isn't evening yet. The meadowlark was gone. The baby woke with a small sound, and the big one shifted to shelter him, Scar pulling tight across her shoulder. Eddie answered with his little pattern, and the baby returned it with the pleased rumble that had become their yes. Helen checked the latch and then checked it again. She angled the lantern so its light fell away from the windows and into the center of the room, a circle of safety no one else could see. She thought of the prints, the size, the careful distance, the way they had not crossed the last 10 feet to the porch. Mercy or strategy. Both can wear the same shoes. The ridge exhaled and took its light with it. The shed kept breathing. Somewhere past the creek in the low rise of firs, metal spoke, not loud, distinct. A crisp bite of steel on steel. The air slapped flat and then left to ring. It came once and finished. The kind of sound that does not need to repeat itself to be believed, and everything in the shed paused on that one hard note that could only mean a trap had shut on whatever had dared to step where someone wanted it to bleed. The sound had come sharp and final, a metal mouth clapping shut somewhere beyond the creek, and the forest had folded in around it like a hand closing. The big one felt it first. Her whole body went rigid, hair lifting, head tilted to catch echoes the shed walls muffled. She slid between Eddie and the draft like a door, breath rounding into that low drum that meant stay. Eddie stilled. Even the lantern flame drew smaller, as if light itself wanted to be less seen. Down in town, the Last Light Tavern held its afternoon quiet. Pool balls asleep under green felt, a Schlitz clock ticking toward supper. The man who pushed through the door smelled of cold and old grease. Coyote fur rimmed his collar. His beard kept the shape of the wind that had hit it, and his eyes did not waste motion. Harlan Briggs bought a coffee and set a coil of cable on the bar like someone laying down a bet. Fingers touched it because fingers do that around new tools. "Aircraft," he said. "Casual, the way you talk about the weather you brought with you. Cam lock, bites and holds. Cat can't twist out. Bear has second thoughts. Heard of a white one up here. Different brings money. Money makes winter shorter." Laughter came, not all at once. A man at the end of the bar mentioned bear cut, but like a joke. Another mentioned cats, said his chickens would sign a petition. Harlan smiled with no teeth. He asked where the creek pinched to a chute, where elk crossed late when snow crusts, where a man could set cable and let the hillside do the pulling. He didn't use the word lucky. He didn't have to. He left with a sack from Stenson's and directions given like they were harmless. Back at the cabin, the day wore thin. Helen stepped outside with the lantern low so its glow fell on her boots, not the yard. The big one's head tracked every tiny sound, then swung to the east toward rock and water. A scrape, somewhere past the juniper. Not loud, clean, steel kissing stone. The baby made a sound that was all nerves and need. Eddie answered with the pattern that meant hold on. The big one moved closer until his shoulder touched the heat of her leg. Helen followed the path Eddie favored, the one that sloped to the creek where he stacked flat rocks and let water talk to him. The lantern's circles slid over bark, frost, grass that kept its color under cold. 2 pines into the timber, the beam found it. A loop the size of a dinner plate. Cable rubbed dull where hands had fought it into shape, its throat dark with a smear that wasn't sap. The anchor had been sunk into a trunk, bark chewed raw where tension had trained it to obey. The loop sat right at the height where a chest would pass if a chest were high and heavy and trying to follow a boy's laugh down to water. She knelt. Cold climbed through her jeans. She didn't touch the cable. She didn't have to. The grease on it held scent the way a pan holds last night's bacon. She swallowed against the taste that pulled up from old memory. Blood flash, wire wine, the silence that follows hurt. She lifted the lantern and saw other sign because now her eyes knew what shape to let in. A faint polish in the dirt where a boot had pivoted. A twig shaved for scent tying. The care that comes from practice. Behind her, in the dark between shed and trees, the big one blew a breath that fogged and drifted. Eddie stood inside it, hands open at his sides. Snow Red tucked his face into his mother's chest and peered out with one red gleam that was not fire and not fear alone. Helen backed away from the loop and followed her own steps home, placing her boots inside of the prints she had made going out, not thinking of it as erasure, but as a kind of prayer. On the porch, she hung the lantern on its hook and did not let her face tell the boy anything he could not carry. She warmed milk. She set the jar to steam. She listened for trucks and heard only the absent shape a truck's sound leaves behind when it doesn't come. Cole Redding's knock came with late light. A knuckle on wood, a weight that meant respect. He took off his hat by habit, eyes measuring the edges of the room the way men do when they don't want to look like they're measuring. He talked weather, glare ice on Joseph Creek, a downed cottonwood over the county road. Then the weight of the real thing found his words. "Don't be alone at night," he said. Not a law, a favor. As he spoke, his gaze slipped to the cuff of Eddie's coat, where a single pale hair clung to wool and refused to float down. He saw it. He let it be, the way you let snow fall on a field you don't own. He set 2 boxes of 30-30 on the table and slid them away, when Helen's hand didn't move. "You call if you need," he said gently, like he was talking to a room that had more ears than it showed him. Then he was gone, boots sure on the steps, truck finding its lane, tail lights spoken of by nobody but the trees. The shed took the warm like it had been built for exactly this. The big one stood watch. Eddie fed small sips and small pauses, learned the heartbeat of patience and the math of enough. Snow Red's fingers found the ridge of the jar ring and tapped it, a quiet metronome that settled the room. When the jar emptied, the little one wriggled free and toddled to the threshold, hunting with eyes and nose like he knew exactly what he wanted. He found it by the jam, a red pebble Eddie had pocketed yesterday and forgotten. Snow Red lifted it, turned it in light, then placed it on the step beside the door, careful, ceremonial, as if he understood altars even if he had never seen a church. Helen watched the stone sit there, twin to the one in Eddie's pocket, red caught inside quartz like a kept ember. She felt something align, a thread run from creek bed to palm to step to breath. A tiny circle drawn in a world too large and too cold for most circles to hold. Night settled without stars. Clouds pressed down and made the yard a smaller room. Helen checked the rear window and the shed latch and then the crawl space hatch out of habit, because habits are what you have when plans would be a lie. The smell of iron and wet wood rose from under the house. She knelt with the lantern and lifted the rag they used to block draft. The flame threw itself flat and then lifted. Boot mud, fresh enough to glisten. Print edges sharp. Toes pointed toward the boards, not away. Someone had stood with his ear to the cabin's belly, listening to the life inside it, taking the measure of breaths and silences, learning a family the way you learn a route you intend to use again. She let the rag fall back into place and felt the floor press cold into her knees while the house and the shed and the trees around them all kept as quiet as they could, which is never quiet enough when someone is close enough to hear you breathe. Rain hammered the roof. Helen woke before the thunder, the way a mother wakes to a wrongness. She cupped the lantern to keep the light small. Eddie stood at the back window with his forehead to the glass, breathing with the storm. When she touched his sleeve, he pressed the creek stone into her palm. The shed latch sat where she'd left it. Still, the room beyond felt like a song cut off mid-note. Straw churned. The wool blanket lay twisted, wet from rain blown through the cracks. A jar had rolled on its side, milk striping the sill in a thin, pale line. No bodies, no breath. Heat clung to the boards. The big one hadn't been gone an hour. The small one had left answers, prints the size of a child's palm, a smear where a knee slid, a loop of white hair snagged on a nail. Eddie lifted it and let it fall, eyes wide. Outside, rain erased and revealed. The lantern found a groove where something heavy had been dragged, shallow at first, then deeper, as if a body had been yanked and then fought. In the churned mud, a cable had chewed a fresh line toward the juniper and the cut that drops to the creek. On the fence, a panel had been lifted and set back. Whoever took them knew how to take things. "Friend," Eddie said, small under the storm. He thumped his chest twice and pointed into the dark. The word asked for a road. They followed the drag through rabbit brush and burrs, across the wash to the chute where floodwater carves a slide each spring. There, the ground told everything. 2 parallel tracks pressed the sand where a cage had rolled. Corners bit and pivoted. Greased steel left a black kiss on rock. The marks ran up the far bank toward timber. Lightning lit the slope, and for a beat, the world went flat as a map. Eddie brought both fists to his sternum and beat a slow rhythm, then drew breath and set their pattern free. 1 short, 2 long. At first there was only rain. Then the pattern came back, thin as a reed whistle through a wall, higher, frayed by fear, but true. The night narrowed to that thread. Eddie answered. The thread answered back, weaker, as if cloth had been stuffed into a mouth that still found a seam to breathe. Helen felt her body decide. She moved through the house fast, so feeling couldn't catch her. A knapsack, 2 canteens, bread, jerky, matches in a dry jar, gauze, a church key, baling twine. She flipped open the utility knife, then slid it into her right boot where leather would keep it close to bone. Eddie's raincoat stayed on Eddie. Hers went over it. She set the latch and left the lamp burning as if a life could be kept by giving it something to come back to. They stepped into rain that tried to shove them back. The lantern guttered and lived. The drag line shone like a warning. Creek water frothed brown and loud. Eddie kept himself between the light and the drop, the way he did around small animals that hadn't learned danger. Helen put her hand on his hood when the path thinned. Not to hold him, to say, "I'm here." The chute pinched into a cleft where boulders leaned together like old men. In their lee, the rain softened. Here the cage had scraped a curve. Here a boot had slipped and dug. Here a thorn cane held a few white hairs so fine the lantern almost missed them. Helen freed one as gently as she'd once freed fishing line from a swallow's foot, as if care could travel back along anything you touch right. The answer note came again, closer now, then stifled, as if a hand had learned it and closed. Eddie's breath hitched. He struck his chest, once, twice, 3 times, and called, voice breaking on the word he owned. "Friend!" Then he tipped his head and shaped the wet dark with that soft whistle, a candle of sound in a drowned room. It reached something alive. The reply arrived as a scrape against wire, a whine under cloth. The ache a creature makes when it's done being brave but isn't done. It hooked into Helen's ribs and pulled. She turned uphill where the cleft opened to the slope. Wind lifted and laid the fir tips. Beyond the next rise a flicker came and went, orange and small, as if a star had fallen and couldn't decide whether to keep burning. She pinched the lantern out and let the dark come up like water. Night rearranged. The flame blinked again, then a second blink offset from it, the way one fire shows itself in a puddle. Between them a low shape sat where rain didn't shine. Cage, tarp, the square of man-work inside a world that hates straight lines. A shadow moved, broad shoulders, a head canted the way a hunter listens to the thing he has already decided to own. Somewhere in that black, the small sound answered and choked. Eddie pressed to her hip, shaking like a string drawn tight. Helen slid her palm to his sternum and steadied that string. The storm eased to a pour. Fire licked up and threw a brief wash over wet bark and wire. Bars shone. A pale smudge moved and stilled. The shape of a man rose and bent and rose again, busy with knots. Helen tasted iron. She set her heel into the cleft for purchase. The knife lay warm against her ankle like a word she hadn't spoken in years but still knew. She leaned close so only Eddie could hear and let her breath shape the gentlest yes she had. Then she started up the slope, slow and certain, toward the orange blink and the small strangled cry that kept finding a way through rain. Rain thinned to a steady pour, the kind that hides footsteps and carries voices only a few yards. Helen and Eddie crested the rise and saw it, a camp stitched together from tarps and stubbornness. One low tent hunkered against a fallen fir, a cage crouched under canvas, a small fire fussing with wet wood. The air tasted of gun oil and rust. It sat on the tongue like a warning. Under the tarp, bars gleamed. The white one curled tight as a cat at the back, eyes ember red in the fire's flutter. The big one knelt with her wrists tied to the cage frame, a strip of canvas knotted around her mouth to turn a roar into a swallow. Her shoulder had been wrapped with a loop of bright line that cut deeper each time she tried to lift. She saw the boy and the woman the way a lighthouse sees a ship. One long turn, then stillness. Movement at the edge of the firelight. Harlan Briggs bent over a camp box, back to the cage, big hands calm, working by feel. He laid out snares, checked a rifle, wiped rain from a scope with the corner of a shirt that had known better days. He looked like every story a town tells itself about a man who won't be stopped until something stops him. Helen pulled Eddie into the shadow of a spruce and listened for the rhythm inside her ribs to steady. She peeled her wet sleeve back and felt for the knife in her boot. Warm. Ready. Eddie looked at the bars and then at her. He pressed his small fist to his chest twice and lifted his chin toward the cage. She nodded. He breathed once like a swimmer and sent their pattern into the rain. One short, two long, soft as a moth. The white one lifted his head and answered through his nose, a thin thread that trembled and held. The big one went rigid, then pushed against the tie until the cord sang. Harlan didn't turn. The storm kept time. Helen slid along the dark edge of the tarp. Canvas brushed her shoulder. Water slipped off in quiet ropes. She found the cable where it bit into a tent stake and followed it to a knot that had been tied by a man who knew he might need to untie it fast. She eased the knife under the wet line and felt its stubborn fibers resist. She didn't saw. She breathed and pressed and let the steel speak in small, patient bites until the cord softened. She waited for the wind to lift and used that noise to hide the last cut. The big one breathed a new sound into the gag, hope mixed with warning. From the other side of the tarp, Eddie moved closer. He planted his boots in mud and put himself between the openings Harlan would use and the cage door. He didn't raise his voice. He used the pattern again, this time shorter, more urgent, the way you'd call a colt that wants to bolt. The white face pressed to the bars and pushed a hand out. Eddie took it for one heartbeat and let go before the movement could draw eyes. Helen slid the knife to the second tie. Rain ticked. The blade kissed the rope and stopped. Another shadow joined Harlan's in the firelight, a man becoming more than rumor. He turned. He had the kind of stillness that means nothing will be left up to chance. His boot hit a pan and didn't clatter. He had taught his boots not to talk. Evening, he said to the rain, because he was a man who spoke to the world as if it answered only him. He stepped around the fire and came up behind Helen like a decision. The barrel found the back of her coat and nudged. "Stand up slow." She did. He set her wrists behind her with a zip of plastic that bit skin. "You walked past a posted sign," he said, voice flat, as if the mountain were a ledger and she was a line item. Eddie stepped into the open with his arms wide, thin body squared to the cage door. "Don't," he said. The small word, a damn. Harlan didn't look at the boy. He was watching the big one, reading the way her weight shifted, noting how her eyes never left the child. He liked to measure leverage before he pulled it. The white one made a sound from somewhere too small to hold so much fear. Harlan's head tipped. "You're a prize," he told the cage, and went to touch the bars like a man tests a fence before he throws a switch. He reached through to tap teeth, to check bite, the way some men check an engine with a palm. The small mouth met his hand and closed. Not a nibble. A clamp that found bone. Harlan swore and yanked back. Blood announced itself in a bright stripe that rain could not quite erase. The big one surged, and the tie went taut until it sang. Helen moved. She pivoted and drove her shoulder into Harlan's knee. A quick, ugly hit, taught by hard years in small rooms. He folded a fraction. She dropped her weight and took that inch like a door opening. Keys on his belt flashed. She hooked them with her bound hands as she fell, caught them awkwardly, and tucked them into her cuff before he could stand. He swung the rifle like a club, and the stock kissed her ribs. Pain lit up and went white. Eddie didn't run. He planted his feet over the lock and spread his arms again, small and absolute. "Move," Harlan said, breath hot with anger. The boy stayed. The rain kept falling. Helen rolled, found her knees, and shoved her cuffed hands through her legs to bring them forward. The keys bit her palm. She found the padlock by feel. Cold iron. She worked the first key and it refused. The second slid and stuck, and then turned with a sound that felt louder than thunder. The lock fell. Harlan heard the small clink and turned in time to see the door jump. The big one exploded into the opening. She hit him with the side of her body like a car leaving its lane. He staggered into the fire and kicked it wide. Sparks took the rein and died mid-air. He reached for a looped line hidden under a tarp and yanked. The world snapped. The net he'd rigged threw itself out of the dark like a thing with a will. It took the big one across the shoulders and cinched when she fought. The more she hauled, the tighter it bit. Ropes hissed through rings and found their knots. She dropped to a knee and rose again, dragging stakes from soft ground and almost tearing free. Almost. The line shot to a high limb where a cam had been set, and the limb took her weight and held. Snow Red slipped from the cage on all fours, shook water like a pup, and slid to Eddie's shins. Eddie curled around him and hummed their tiny song, one short, two long, a wild lullaby under a storm that wanted to drown it. Harlan wiped his hand on his coat and lifted the rifle proper now, blood slicking the grip. Face a hard plate under a wet brim. He stepped to the side to see past the boy. Helen rose into him again, smaller than his shadow and heavier than her bones had any right to be. The barrel swung. The world tightened. Lightning walked the ridge and froze everything in silver. At the edge of the timber beyond the camp, something stood that made the night look thinner, taller than any man, broad as the door to a barn, not moving, eyes like two coins catching light and throwing it back gold. It watched without blinking, and the forest leaned toward it the way a crowd leans when the person who matters has finally arrived and has not yet decided what happens next. Snow arrived like shattered glass sifted from a broken sky. It took the edges off the world and sharpened every sound. Harlan's rifle came up. The big one bunched against the net. Eddie curled around the white bundle, and Helen felt the storm lean in as if it wanted a better view. The first shot cracked a fir limb and blew needles across Eddie's hood. The second chewed bark a foot from Helen's cheek. She shoved the boy toward the chute above the camp, boots skidding, hands burning on ice-crusted rock. Behind them, the big one ripped at the net until the cord sang, tore 3 strands, bled for it, tore again. They climbed into wind that pushed breath back into their mouths. Snow thickened to powder so fine it moved like smoke. Harlan followed, steady as a metronome, pausing only to jack a new round. The metal action a bright, cold sound inside the white noise. The cage lay on its side, door flung open, fire kicked flat and dying. Eddie carried Snow Red against his chest, chin tucked, humming their small pattern into the cloth. 1 short, 2 long. The baby answered, thin and brave. Helen cut the last of the net from the big one's shoulder with a saw of her boot knife, then got her under the arm and hauled. Blood warmed her wrist and went cold again in the same instant. They dropped into a draw, where wind slid over them like a hand. For a breath, the world shrank to ribs and steam. The big one stood, shook snow from her hair, and took the white bundle back, tucking it under the cage of her body as if the storm were a single claw. Harlan hit the lip of the draw and sighted. "That one," he said to the wind, meaning the white life that turned men into rumor. He fired. The shot took a dead branch. It fell and shattered and kept falling, loud as a door slamming in an empty church. Helen stepped in front of Eddie. "No." 1 word, thin as paper, somehow heavy. Harlan worked the lever. His wounded hand slipped on wet metal. He swore and wiped blood on his coat and drew a bead on what he thought he could still own. A new report split the storm. Not his rifle. A warning round snapped over his hat and found a tree high up where it could do nothing but talk. Sheriff Cole came in from the flank, coat rimed white, 30-30 shouldered, boots certain on a slope that had tricked men better than him. "Put it down," Cole said. "Calm." Wind took his words and gave them back in pieces. "This stops here." Harlan didn't lower the gun. Snow pasted to his beard and melted there. "You going to write the Ridge a ticket? That's not law. That's a paycheck walking. Law is people not dying when we can help it," Cole said, eyes steady on the barrel, seeing and not seeing the boy, the woman, the giants, the line between. "You step past that. You're not hunting. You're ending. "Ending pays," Harlan said, and shifted 2 inches to clear the big one's shoulder. The white bundle moved. The big one moved faster. She saw the angle Harlan wanted and stepped into it, body a wall built for storms. The rifle cracked. Snow jumped from her back as if slapped by a great invisible hand. She grunted, not with fear, with effort, as if lifting a beam. Another shot spat from Harlan's gun before Cole could fire again. The big one took that one too. Fur darkened. She turned so the white smallness stayed behind her bones. The sound she made then rose under the gale and stood up inside it. Not anger, not even pain. A call with the edges worn off by time, low and long, pitched to a place wind respects. Eddie felt it in his teeth. Helen felt it in the ache where she kept the years she didn't talk about. Harlan felt it and hated that he felt anything. Cole fired again, clean at Harlan's boot. Snow jumped. "Enough," he said, and stepped forward, closing the angle, choosing the thing that could still be chosen. Harlan's barrel flicked toward him. Their eyes held. The whole hill held. The standoff broke from the outside. A shape detached from the timberline and came down the slope without hurry. Taller than a door. Shoulders like a ridge. Hair black with wet. Eyes catching what little light the storm allowed and returning it heavy and gold. He didn't roar. He didn't need to. He arrived and the storm adjusted. Harlan swung toward the new target because men like him always pick the largest thing to conquer. Cole took that instant and shouldered into him, arm to barrel, barrel to sky, shot into nothing where it could become no one's grief. They crashed into scrub, rifles tangling, boots carving mud out of ice. Harlan hit hard and rolled, came up with a knife in his good hand, eyes flat as slate. The big one half knelt, half fell. Blood smoked on the snow. The black giant reached her in 3 strides that felt like old ground, remembered. He slid an arm under her, slid the small white body into the cradle that opened across his chest, and lifted both as if he had done this before. On other nights, in other storms, when the world asked too much and gave too little, he turned once to face Helen. Snow swirled between them, a slow veil in fast wind. The big one, shivering with hurt, found Helen's eyes through it. No words. A small nod, almost nothing, and in that almost nothing a thank you, a passing of a weight, a promise 2 mothers make when a road splits and neither can follow the other. Then the black giant stepped into the white, and the white closed around him. The wind pulled the camp smoke flat and erased it. Cole held Harlan pinned with a knee, breath loud, grit on his teeth. Harlan looked past him into the storm that had just taken his fortune and showed his face to it like a man memorizing an enemy. Eddie and Helen moved to the open draw. The snow there held a record no court would accept. 1 set of prints broad and deep. 1 set smaller laid inside them as if taut, and between them a drag where a net had failed and a life had insisted. The wind went to work like a careful clerk. Edges softened, toes blurred. The trail did not vanish all at once. It dimmed, then dimmed more, then kept the faintest ghost of direction, as if the mountain, just this once, was willing to leave a hint for those who had earned it. Cole looked up at Helen. Whatever he meant to say stayed in his mouth. Harlan's knife lay bright in the snow, and the storm began to cover that too, patient, thorough. The way winter forgives nothing and hides everything it can. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It unstitched winter in small, forgiving seams. Ice letting go of the creek stone by stone, snowbanks thinning to gray lace. A slow tapping from the gutter when the sun found the tin roof and warmed it enough to make it speak. The yard turned back to earth. The fence posts leaned the way old men do when the game finally ends. In the afternoons, wind carried the wet smell of thawed duff and old smoke. Eddie took to the porch like it was church. He sat cross-legged on the top step, jacket unzipped, the creek stone warm in his palm from being held and held. He whistled soft, 1 short, 2 long, then waited. listening into the trees as if the trees kept time for him. Sometimes only the drip answered. Sometimes a jay scolded and quit. Once a deer moved through the brush and left a thin line on the air, the way animals do when they pass between weather and thought. Inside, Helen moved quieter than she used to. Not because she feared a knock, though knocks can still cut straight through a morning. Quieter because the house seemed to ask it of her, as if the boards remembered being listened to from underneath and now wanted to be kind in return. She stacked kindling with care. She hung a pot and let steam fog the window. When she glanced out, Eddie was there in his spot, chin tipped toward the ridge, the small pattern a thread he never dropped. The slope wore its wounds like any living thing, the scuffed places where men fought, where a net burned and snapped, where blood hit snow and then simply became part of it. Spring had pressed its thumb over all that, not to deny it, to keep it. The wind kept the sound of that winter tucked away, and on some afternoons it laid a thin piece of it down again, just enough to make a chest tighten and then release. One noon, after a morning of rain that had finished its work and moved on, Eddie stepped out and stopped with both hands in the air the way he does when he finds a hatchling or a dropped feather. On the second step, side by side as if placed by someone who knew how things should sit, lay two red stones, not painted, not ordinary. Creek-washed quartz with the river's old fire trapped inside, pink like a sun you can look at a long time. They made their own light without glow. Eddie knelt and touched the nearer one with a knuckle, warm from the day. He didn't pick it up. He looked left and right and then up into the trees the way you look at a window when you hear a voice you know in the next room. "Came back," he said, not louder than the drip. Helen stood in the doorway and felt everything inside her quiet. She thought of the first stone in his pocket. She thought of small hands tapping a jar ring like a drum rim. She thought of the big head lifting as the old lullaby found its shape in a shed where milk steamed and hope tried to learn how to stand. Her fingers found Eddie's shoulder and rested there. She didn't need to say what he already knew. A thread of white clung to the door jamb where splinters catch anything passing close. Not gray like winter wool. Not silver like horsehair. White like breath on glass. Clean, fine, and whole. It had found that nail with intention or accident. The ridge doesn't write footnotes, but there it was, unblooded now, like a line drawn with a quiet hand and left for whoever keeps a house to read. Helen didn't lift it. Some things do better staying where they decided to land. Days opened. Sheriff Cole stopped by once with a sack of flour and said something about the county road he had to fix before the 4th. His eyes went to the porch the way eyes do when they wish to mark and unmark in the same second. He didn't mention winter. He held his hat by the brim like a man who knows a hat can be a shield in one season and a flag in another. Nights lost their teeth and found their songs. When clouds kept their distance and the stars came out in their stubborn thousands, sound traveled as it ought to. You could hear the creek again after months of it being a buried thought, all whisper and glint. You could hear small lives recomposing themselves in the grass. Eddie's whistle learned to sit lower in the throat, softer, more certain. It sounded like someone who knows he will be answered, even if the answer takes its time. It came on a Sunday evening after a long, clean blue day. The light had gone milk soft, and the ridge held it the way a hand holds a match. Eddie whistled his small pattern and leaned his head against the porch post. Wind ran the meadow and left it shining. Then the sound he waited for started as if it had been moving from a long distance and only now reached human ear. Low, round. Not a call to hunt, not a warning. A tone that remembered a lullaby and returned it, careful with its edges, respectful of the house that had made it. It crossed the yard like fog and touched the step where the red stones sat. The pines breathed in and out once, and you could have sworn their needles chimed. Helen's hand found the back of the boy's neck and curled there. She didn't count. She didn't pray. She didn't bargain. She matched her breath to the note and let it move through her. In the sound, Winter unrolled itself just enough to show its last page, and then it closed. Whoever stood out there in the line of firs did not enter the light. Whoever carried the weight the ridge had given him did not ask for anything more than the moment to be heard. When the air settled, Eddie picked up one stone and left the other. He set the first on the sill by the kitchen window where sunrise lands most mornings, a little altar without rules, and he pressed his thumbprint into the thin film of damp it had gathered, sealing the promise the way boys seal things when they don't have words big enough yet. The second stone stayed on the step beside the door, waiting under weather the way a good sign waits. Not for proof, not for witnesses, only for the right feet to pass by again when the mountain says the time is right. Sometimes the things that change us the most are not the loud, dramatic moments, but the quiet ones that slip past unnoticed. The shared glance, the hand offered without demand, the choice to protect rather than possess. In a world so often defined by what can be taken, it is the act of giving that carries the deepest weight. Compassion is not a grand gesture. It is the willingness to stand in the cold with another, to carry their burden for a while, even when no one is watching. We live in a time where difference is often met with suspicion, where unfamiliar shapes and unfamiliar truths are seen first as threats. But the measure of our humanity has never been in how we treat what we understand. It is in how we treat what we don't. The heart grows not by building walls, but by opening doors, even when fear tells us to bolt them shut. There will always be a choice between the easy road of turning away and the harder road of leaning in. The easy road keeps our hands clean, but our hearts empty. The harder road asks more of us. It asks for patience when we want quick answers, for trust when we want control, for gentleness when the world tells us to harden. Yet that is the road that changes not just the lives we touch, but our own in ways we cannot measure until years later. And perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath every story worth telling. We are not defined by what we keep, but by what we are willing to shelter. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, leaves a trace, like a footprint in snow, fragile but real, proof that for a moment, the world was warmer because we were in it. Life will keep testing us. It will keep presenting us with the unfamiliar, the difficult, the inconvenient. But if we can meet those moments with the courage to see past the surface, if we can reach for understanding instead of retreating into judgment, then we are doing the only work that truly matters. And in that work, there is a kind of immortality. Long after we are gone, the warmth we leave behind will continue to ripple outward, touching lives we will never know. That is how stories outlive their tellers. That is how hope travels. Quietly, insistently, hand to hand, heart to heart. If this story has stirred something in you, if it's reminded you of the power of kindness, of the beauty in what's different, or of the courage it takes to protect what's vulnerable, then I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your reflections in the comments, and if you'd like to journey with us through more stories like this, don't forget to follow and subscribe. Your voice, your presence, keeps this circle of stories alive.